Welcome to ZoomInData, your go-to channel for in-depth Azure Cloud, Serverless, and modern development interview preparation. In this video, we dive deep into the top 25 Azure Functions Isolated Worker Model interview questions for 2026. Perfect for developers, architects, and anyone preparing for AZ-204 certification or modernizing .NET-based serverless applications. We cover the isolated worker architecture, differences from in-process, migration steps, middleware, dependency injection, HTTP handling, startup configuration, cold starts, logging, debugging, performance implications, gRPC support, versioning, troubleshooting, and best practices, all explained in clear, detailed, interview-ready technical language to help you confidently ace your next interview. 1. What is the isolated worker model in Azure Functions? The isolated worker model is a modern execution model in Azure Functions, introduced with .NET 5 and made the default in .NET 8+, where the function code runs in a completely separate worker process from the main function's host process. This separation allows the worker to run on any .NET version, even newer ones not supported by the host, provides full process isolation, and enables ASP.NET Core-like middleware pipelines. It is the recommended model for all new .NET Functions development in 2026 because it decouples function runtime from host runtime and improves startup performance. Unlike the legacy in-process model, the isolated model communicates with the host via gRPC over standard streams, giving greater flexibility and safety. 2. How does isolated model differ from in-process? In the in-process model, function code runs directly inside the function's host process, sharing the same runtime and memory space as the host extensions and bindings. In the isolated model, function code executes in a separate .NET process, the worker, communicating with the host via gRPC, which provides full process isolation and removes dependency on the host's .NET version. Isolated model supports ASP.NET Core middleware, custom startup configuration, and any .NET version, even future versions. In-process is locked to the host's .NET version. Isolated model has slightly higher cold start overhead in some scenarios but offers better security, extensibility, and long-term compatibility. 3. Explain advantages of isolated worker. Full process isolation prevents function code from crashing the host process or being affected by host bugs, extensions, improving reliability and security. Ability to run any .NET version, including preview or future versions, without waiting for host runtime upgrades. Full ASP.NET Core middleware pipeline support for custom request, response handling, logging, authentication, and telemetry. Better dependency management, no shared assemblies with host, easier testing, and improved startup performance in many real-world workloads. 4. How do you migrate from in-process to isolated? Change the project SDK to Microsoft.NET SDK, Functions and Target.NET 8, or later, update package references to Microsoft Azure Functions Worker. Replace in-process attributes with isolated equivalents, e.g., function, instead of function name. HTTP trigger stays the same but middleware is now possible. Move startup configuration to a class implementing iFunctions startup or use the new program.cs style with host builder. Update host. JSON to set, extension bundle, if needed. Test locally with func start, .NET isolated, and deploy. most bindings and triggers remain compatible. 5. What .NET versions support Isolated Worker? The Isolated Worker model officially supports .NET 5, .NET 6, .NET 7, and .NET 8, recommended in 2026, with .NET 9 preview support already available. .NET 8 is the long-term support, LTS, version and the default target for new isolated projects. Future .NET versions can be adopted quickly because the worker process is independent of the host runtime. .NET Framework is not supported in isolated model, only in process legacy runtime. 6. Explain middleware support in isolated model. Isolated model introduces full ASP.NET Core-style middleware pipeline for HTTP triggers, allowing custom pre- and post-processing of requests and responses. Middleware can handle logging, authentication, request validation, telemetry enrichment, or response transformation across all HTTP functions. Register middleware in program.cs using Builder. Use middleware less than my middleware greater than, or extension methods. Middleware executes in the order registered, with access to HTTP context, similar to ASP.NET Core controllers. 7. How does dependency injection work in isolated? Isolated model uses the full ASP.NET Core dependency injection container, iService collection, configured in program.cs. Register services, singletons, scoped, transient, using Builder, services, add singleton less than my service greater than, or extension methods. Inject services into function methods via constructor injection or method parameters. Supports scoped services per invocation, singleton services shared across invocations, and automatic disposal. 8. Explain HTTP trigger in isolated model. HTTP triggers in isolated model receive HTTP request data and return HTTP response data, or iAction result via middleware. Full ASP.NET Core routing, middleware, and model binding are available, making it feel very close to ASP.NET Core APIS. Supports OpenAPI, Swagger integration through middleware or attributes. Authorization, cause, and rate limiting are handled via middleware instead of host. JSON. 9. How do you configure startup in isolated worker? Use the new program.cs style, recommended in .NET 8+, with host. Create default builder, or functions worker application builder. Configure services, middleware, and host options in the builder before calling build. Supports configuration providers, app settings, JSON, environment variables, key vault. Legacy iFunctions startup interface still supported, but program.cs is the modern, preferred approach. 10. What is the process isolation benefit? Process isolation means a crash, memory leak, or unhandled exception in function code cannot crash the main function's host or affect other functions. Allows running different .NET versions or even preview runtimes without host compatibility issues. Prevents shared assembly conflicts between host extensions and function dependencies. Provides stronger security boundary and easier debugging, troubleshooting. 11. Explain extension loading in isolated model. Extensions, bindings, are loaded into the worker process instead of the host, reducing startup overhead. Extension bundles are still used but downloaded into the worker process context. Custom bindings can be registered via worker startup code. Extension loading is faster and more isolated compared to in-process model. 12. How do you handle cold starts in isolated? Isolated model generally has lower cold start times than in process for .NET 6 Plus due to separate worker process initialization. Premium plan pre-warmed instances virtually eliminate cold starts for all triggers. Use minimal dependencies and avoid heavy initialization in startup code. Monitor cold start duration in application insights and optimize accordingly. 13. What is the performance impact of isolated model? Isolated model has slightly higher baseline overhead due to gRPC communication between host and worker. Cold start performance is often better for .NET 8 Plus because worker can initialize faster independently. Throughput and latency are comparable or better for most workloads due to isolation and middleware optimizations. Memory usage is separated, preventing host memory pressure from affecting function performance. 14. Explain logging in isolated worker. Logging uses the standard Microsoft extensions logging framework with iLogger injected into functions. Logs are automatically forwarded to application insights via the host process. Supports structured logging with custom dimensions and scopes. Configure log levels via host, JSON or app settings. JSON in isolated startup. 15. How do you debug isolated functions? Run locally with func start, .NET isolated. VS Code, Visual Studio attaches to the worker process. Breakpoints in function code and middleware are hit normally during debugging. Use Logstream and Application Insights live metrics for real-time insights. Debug startup code by setting breakpoints in program.cs. 16. What is the function startup class? Function startup is the legacy startup interface for isolated worker configuration, pre.NET 8. Implement configure to register services and middleware. Still supported but replaced by program.cs style in .NET 8 Plus. Used for backward compatibility in older isolated projects. 17. How do you register services in startup? In program.cs, recommended, use builder. Services. Add singleton less than my service greater than, or scoped, transient registrations. Register middleware with builder. Use middleware less than my middleware greater than. Configure HTTP client factory, logging, and configuration providers in the same builder. Supports all ASP.NET Core service registration patterns and lifetimes. 18. Explain binding support in isolated. All existing bindings, HTTP, blob, Q, Cosmos DB, etc., are fully supported in isolated model. Bindings are resolved in the worker process using the same extension bundle system. Custom bindings can be registered via worker startup code. Attribute-based bindings remain identical to in-process model. 19. How do you handle configuration in isolated? Use the standard ASP.NET Core configuration system, builder, configuration, add JSON file, add environment variables, etc. Access configuration via iConfiguration injection in functions or middleware. Supports app settings, JSON, user secrets, key vault, and environment variables. Configuration is reloaded on worker restart for dynamic updates. 20. What is the future of isolated model? Isolated model is the default and recommended path for all new .NET Functions development in 2026 and beyond. Microsoft is investing heavily in performance, middleware, and gRPC improvements. Future .NET versions will be supported immediately via Isolated Worker. In-process model will remain for legacy compatibility but not receive new features. 21. Explain gRPC support in Isolated. Isolated model uses gRPC over standard streams for communication between host and worker process. Enables efficient, low latency, bidirectional communication for trigger events and responses. Supports streaming scenarios and advanced error handling. Future enhancements will deepen gRPC integration for custom scenarios. 22. How do you version isolated functions? Version functions by changing function name or using versioned namespaces, e.g., myfunction v2. Start new instances with versioned orchestrator names while old versions complete. Use external version field in input payload for internal versioning logic. Avoid breaking changes to existing functions. Create new versions instead. 23. What is the worker process lifecycle? Worker process starts when the first function invocation arrives or host initializes it. Runs continuously while host is active. Restarts on configuration change or failure. Host monitors worker health and restarts if unresponsive. Graceful shutdown on host stop or scale in events. 24. How do you troubleshoot isolated worker issues? Check application insights for worker process startup failures and exceptions. Enable detailed host logging in host. JSON for worker initialization details. Use func start, verbose to see worker process output locally. Inspect worker process logs in Kudu or via Azure Monitor. 25. Best practices for isolated worker adoption. Use isolated model for all new .NET 8+ projects to gain full middleware, DI, and future-proofing benefits. Leverage ASP.NET Core middleware for cross-cutting concerns, logging, auth, validation. Keep startup configuration clean and use configuration providers for environment-specific settings. Monitor worker startup time and cold starts. Use premium plan pre-warmed instances for latency-critical applications. Thank you for watching. If this video helps you prepare for your Azure Functions interview, please give it a thumbs up and share it with your network. Don't forget to subscribe to ZoomInData and hit the bell icon for more in-depth cloud computing, serverless, and Azure interview prep videos every week. Drop your questions or topic requests in the comments. Let's zoom in on your success together.